Hi, friend. I'm Holly Geiger Lee. Today, we're going to dive into G.K. Chesterton's love of debate and dialogue. It's central to many of his friendships. Although his closest friends were mostly like minded Christians, many of his dear friends were not. A prime example is George Bernard Shaw, who was a famous playwright in the early 20th century. Hear what G.K. had to say about his friend. I quote, "He is something of a pagan," said Chesterton of George Bernard Shaw, "and like many other pagans, he is a very fine man." The assessment hints at the complexity of their relationship. This kind of quote is rare these days, I believe. Too often, when we challenge another opposing viewpoint with biblical truth, it's taken as a personal offense. "You're a bigot. You're hateful," can be translated into, "You hurt my feelings." Okay. It's very personal, right? It's taken as a personal offense. What do you think? Let's hear what a typical debate might look like from these two very unlikely friends. They were not afraid of hurting each other's feelings, and they stayed true friends to the very end. Thank you for listening to today's G.K. Chesterton subject, The Art of Dialogue and Debate. We're just going to pretend for a moment that we're in London in the early 1900s, the 1920s to be exact. Welcome to the G.K. Chesterton George Bernard Shaw debates. We have two very different men with different worldviews standing in a London debate hall. In physicality, they could not be any less alike. One is about 300 pounds and stands well over 6 feet tall. If he could debate and smoke cigars at the same time, you bet he would be biting a cigar right now. He is holding a sword stick in one hand, not a cane, and his vest is buttoned, but it appears it could burst open at any second. The other man dons a loose-fitting black jacket, a necktie, and a white beard that cascades down onto his chest. He looks like he could be blown away in a sudden gust of wind. Despite their physical differences, these two men differ as much or even more in their beliefs. G.K. Chesterton, by this point, has already converted to Roman Catholicism. George Bernard Shaw, a staunch atheist, makes fun of Roman Catholicism. He embraces a postmodern worldview, as exemplified in his quotes, "There is only one religion, though there are 100 versions of it," and "the golden rule is that there is no golden rule." G.K. Chesterton is called the Prince of Paradox, and rightly so. George Bernard Shaw attempts it in the former statement. Notwithstanding their differences, these two men remain friends until G.K. Chesterton's death in 1936. Friendship is something of which G.K. Chesterton is well acquainted with. He spoke of it frequently. Before the debate, he turns to you and says, "It is not merely true that a creed unites men, nay, a difference of creed unites men. So long as it is a clear difference, a boundary unites. Many a magnanimous Moslem and chivalrous Crusader must have been nearer to each other because they were both dogmatists than any two agnostics. I say God is one, and I say God is one, but also three. That is the beginning of a good, quarrelsome, manly friendship." And so it is established that G.K. Chesterton believes one can find understanding with someone who takes a definite stance on something, albeit a completely opposing stance. A prerequisite for being G.K. Chesterton's friend is to be able to engage in dialogue over the things the two of you do not agree on. Banter is a sign of endearment between G.B. Shaw and G.K. Chesterton. They can banter in a friend's house, but they can also engage in discourse in the forum, the public debate. These two men are well known for their entertaining debates. The debate hall is abuzz with the anticipation of a stimulating evening. This is where debate and dialogue intersect with classical education. Dialectical engagement is encouraged as opponents examine a topic from various angles, much like Chesterton's approach to debate. Let the intellectual sparring begin. The mediator, Hilaire Belloc, is also a good friend of Chesterton's and is aligned with his worldview. Let's contrast the two opposing worldviews. Chesterton with his defense of a traditional, mere Christian, natural law view of the human person and human history, as opposed to Shaw's aggressive, multifaceted modernism, his feminism, Nietzscheanism, socialism, vegetarianism, creative evolutionism, and eugenics. We hear Hilaire Belloc's booming voice welcome the crowd and introduce the debaters. I am not allowed to say what I think. At any rate, they are going to debate this sort of thing. I know not what more to say. They are about to debate. You are about to listen. I am about to sneer. Mr. Shaw begins. Mr. Chesterton tells and prints the most extravagant lies. He takes ordinary incidents of human life, commonplace middle-class life, and gives them a monstrous and strange and gigantic outline. He fills suburban gardens with the most impossible murders, and not only does he invent the murders, but also succeeds in discovering the murderer who never committed the murders. I do very much the same sort of thing. I promulgate lies in the shape of plays. But whereas Mr. Chesterton takes events which you think ordinary and makes them gigantic and colossal to reveal their essential miraculousness, I am rather inclined to take these things in their utter commonplaceness, and yet to introduce among them outrageous ideas which scandalize the ordinary playgoer, and send him away wondering whether he has been standing on his head all his life, or whether I am standing on mine. Do you see the difference between the two men's approaches? G.K. Chesterton takes the ordinary and unveils the extraordinary. G.B. Shaw takes the ordinary, looks at it as commonplace, then goes on to elaborate on his own supposedly new ideas. His goal is to shock his audience. Yet Ecclesiastes 1:9 reminds us that what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. I suppose G.B. Shaw would find everything as monotonous as the writer of Ecclesiastes, which is certainly a symptom of our humanity. We are sometimes unable to see the extraordinary or miraculous. However, we can read that even the writer of Ecclesiastes concludes with, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. It's clear that the writer of Ecclesiastes has a God-centered worldview, as is revealed in the last bit of Ecclesiastes. And then somebody like G.K. Chesterton walks into the room and astounds us with his paradox. He might not be the sober-minded, everything in moderation messenger of Ecclesiastes, but he does have a God-centered worldview all the same. This is what distinguishes him from his friend G.B. Shaw. Littering Chesterton's writings are brilliant usages of paradox. What is paradox? Chesterton goes to the literal Greek meaning of the word, which is something which is against the received opinion. But more importantly, says Chesterton, the word is used to express the idea of a verbal contradiction, some kind of collision between what is seemingly and what is really true. The truest paradox is the gospel. He that shall lose his life, the same shall save it. G.K. Chesterton makes much of this gospel paradox in his book Orthodoxy. The false and disheartening optimism of the modern age aims to prove that we fit into the world. G.K. Chesterton recognizes that Christian optimism is based on the fact that we do not fit into the world. The paradox is also this. G.K. Chesterton finds happiness in realizing that man is not an animal, but a monstrosity. While the humanist optimist dwells on the naturalness of everything, the Christian optimist dwells on the unnaturalness of everything in the light of the supernatural. The man Chesterton is paradox personified. He thinks about all things backward to reach their beginnings, to penetrate their truth, as one journalist puts it. Back to the debate hall. Amid a few of his opponent's criticisms on his overuse of paradox merely for effect, Chesterton brightly answers with a sparkle in his eye. Everybody takes it for granted that universal and ordinary arrangements, historic institutions, daily habits are reasonable. They are good. They are sensible. They are holy and splendid often enough, but they are not reasonable. They are themselves paradoxes. Paradox is built into the very foundations of human affairs. I use paradox to point out an element of mere blunder and blank mistake in many of the current assertions, many of which Mr. Shaw holds dear. Everyone is having fun, though. Mr. Shaw and Mr. Chesterton wrap up their closing arguments. The moderator, Mr. Belloc, closes with a poem. The crowd spills out onto the London street. Mr. Shaw, Mr. Chesterton, and Mr. Belloc pose for a photograph. Then they go to a nearby pub or a friend's house and enjoy each other's company. They might not agree on much, but they can recognize that differences in conviction do not automatically make others the enemy. They recognize that other people can be persuaded. They recognize even the goodness in their opponents. Years later, Mrs. Frances Chesterton receives a handwritten letter in the mail following her husband G.K.'s death. It was from George Bernard Shaw, who was mourning his friend's loss greatly. He was worried that Frances's grief might be worsened by the revelation of unexpected debt, as G.K. was never savvy with finances. It seems the most ridiculous thing in the world that I, 18 years older than Gilbert, should be heartlessly surviving him. However, this is only to say that if you have any temporary bothers that I can remove, a line on a postcard or 3 figures will be sufficient. In great tenderness, Shaw added, "The trumpets are sounding for him," in closing his letter. This reference to Christian's entry into the celestial city in Pilgrim's Progress showed that although he did not share Chesterton's hope of heaven, something of that hope was etched in George Bernard Shaw's memory. How Shaw, so very different in his beliefs, could have written this if Chesterton had not been winsome and compelling, with a loving heart and great faith, is beyond the scope of reality. The friendship the two shared was indeed special. Can it be brought back between people today? Can we once more engage in dialogue, the Christian, classical way, thinking about our beliefs and examining different angles from a Christ-centered worldview? We can be thankful for G.K. Chesterton's example. Thank you for listening.